Egypt, 30 BC. The day, August 12th. The most dramatic day in the history of the 1,000-year-old civilization of Egypt. Cleopatra VII of the Ptolemy dynasty, queen of Upper and Lower Egypt, commits suicide by allowing herself to be bitten by an asp, the symbol of ancient Egypt. By this action, Cleopatra not only ends her life, she also delivers her beloved city, Alexandria, and the entire Egyptian empire into the hands of her bitter enemy, the aggressors from the north, the Romans. Thus ends one of the most glorious monarchies in the history of civilization. The city of Alexandria is situated in the northern part of Egypt, where the Nile widens like a web at its famous delta and flows into the Mediterranean Sea after winding thousands of miles through the desert. Today, Alexandria has the second largest population in Egypt after Cairo. From the time it was founded in 332 BC by Alexander the Great, it remained the capital of Egypt until the death of Cleopatra, when the kingdom became part of the Roman Empire and one of the richest provinces in North Africa. The rapid urbanization of Alexandria has made it difficult to find treasures in the ancient city center where ruins remain buried beneath city streets and buildings. The situation is quite different than it is in the religious centers of Karnak and Luxor, and the ancient city of Thebes, where streets, buildings, and huge monuments still allow us to imagine their original splendor. The Alexandria of Cleopatra's time, the marvelous city the queen loved more than any other, has therefore been lost forever. However, if we look closely, we can still piece together the way in which Cleopatra lived and the reasons Alexandria was such a powerful capital. Cleopatra was the last descendant of the great pharaohs, and a highly educated woman. Her great cunning and romantic liaisons with Roman generals Julius Caesar and Mark Antony allowed her to hold on to this magnificent city and keep Alexandria intact. For more than 2,000 years, Alexandria was the largest city of Egypt. Its great port and the way it was laid out by Alexander the Great allowed it to grow quickly. When Cleopatra took over in 51 BC, it was the commercial and political hub of the Egyptian Empire. We can imagine Cleopatra looking out lovingly over her city, perhaps from a perch in the magnificent lighthouse on the island of Pharos. The stones from the fallen lighthouse now lie crumbled in the sea. But when it was built in 280 BC, the lighthouse of Pharos at Alexandria was one of the 7 wonders of the world. From its high balcony, Cleopatra could see her extensive kingdom in every direction as far as 60 miles away. Of the famous 7 wonders, that is, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, the Pharos of Alexandria, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, and the Pyramids of Giza. Only the pyramids are still standing today. The few remains that were left of the Pharos of Alexandria were incorporated into a fortress at the port. The lighthouse was built by the architect Sostratos of Cnidus near the middle of the 3rd century BC, and during the reign of Ptolemy II, Philadelphos, one of Cleopatra's ancestors. Numerous earthquakes had damaged the lighthouse until, in 1480, Sultan Qaitbay Bai had the fortress built using many of the remains of the lighthouse. Some granite columns are still visible on the main door and on the boundary walls that plunge into the sea. The lighthouse, along with the other 5 lost wonders of the ancient world, is shrouded in mystery. What did it really look like? How big was it? Considering that Egypt had so little wood, what material did they use to keep the great beacon burning? There are some drawings and descriptions from travelers who visited the lighthouse before it was destroyed, but they tend to be confusing. What does exist, however, although it was never made public, is a small-scale copy of the lighthouse in perfect condition, made in the same period as the real one. It is here in a place called Abu Sir, a village nearly 25 miles from Alexandria. The archaeological remains of the ancient city of Taposiris Manya, a thriving North African city during Cleopatra's lifetime, surround the village. This lighthouse, just over 50 feet high, doesn't have the majesty of the Pharos, but it does give us an idea of what it must have looked like. The great lighthouse was 3 stories high, with the first story square, the second octagonal, and the third circular. Perhaps it wasn't the only one of its kind built. The coastline between Alexandria and Taposiris could have had many such lighthouses. If we project this architectural model upon the old fort in Alexandria, we can see what the great lighthouse looked like. It is a 3-story structure, surrounded at the base by some small temples and an enclosure. The light it projected could be seen tens of miles away, and even to this day, we still wonder how that was possible. They must have used reflecting mirrors, but the fuel must have been wood, hard to find in the area, or straw mixed with animal dung, a compound that emitted great heat but little light. Archaeologists have recently guessed that the enclosure was for storing flammable material, perhaps petroleum that was already being used in those days. For Cleopatra, who might have wanted to look for a sailing ship on the horizon bringing messages from Rome, the building was perfect. It was 500 feet high, a record for a monument of the ancient world. The history of Egypt's last years is closely related to the life of its great queen. Cleopatra descended from the dynasty of the Ptolemies, founded by Ptolemy I Soter, a Macedonian general under Alexander the Great. There is debate as to what she looked like. She is portrayed on some coins, perhaps inaccurately, with a protruding chin and a prominent nose. Yet she surely must have been charming and charismatic, and we know she was determined and strong-willed and undoubtedly a shrewd politician. At the beginning of her reign, when she was only 15 years old, Cleopatra embarked on a southbound journey up the Nile, officially for religious reasons. As the pharaoh, her presence had been requested at a place called Armont, just south of Thebes, to participate in a ceremony. It may have been on this trip that Cleopatra for the first time saw the Great Pyramids of Giza near Cairo. She was probably as stunned as we are today to see these massive and beautiful monuments. Structures built over 2,000 years before Cleopatra was born. The pharaohs before her had constructed the pyramids as tombs for themselves and their immediate families, and as temples of worship. Cleopatra often took trips within her kingdom. Apart from her normal duties as sovereign, she wanted to make sure that her dynasty was continuing the legacy started by the pharaohs who preceded her. She must have sailed up the Nile to the city of Dendera, on the river's left bank, because the greatest development of both the city and temple of Dendera date from Cleopatra's time, the last period of the Ptolemaic dynasty. They are examples of the notable architecture accomplished during Cleopatra's reign. Burned by the sun and wind and swallowed up by the desert sand, almost nothing remains of the ancient city of Dendera today, except for one imposing structure that's still standing, the enclosed sanctuary with a temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor. Hathor, wife of Horus and mother of Ihi, god of music, was the ancient Egyptian goddess of love and was generally depicted with human features. Horus was the son of Isis, the mother god of Egypt, and of Osiris, god of the underworld and judge of the dead. The personal implications connected to worshipping these powerful gods was surely the main reason why Cleopatra was interested in the sanctuary. These implications are still legible in stone and are one of the most interesting enigmas of ancient Egyptian history. In ancient times, Dendera was called Tantere, but under the Ptolemaic dynasty it was known as Tantairus, its Greek name. Cleopatra would have been familiar with both names, since, according to ancient sources, she spoke 7 languages. To this day, the sanctuary appears like a real city surrounded by mighty walls, 330 yards long on both sides. The main gate, obviously added later, dates from the time of Roman emperors Domitian and Trajan, who were ruling the land 200 years after Cleopatra's death. Through the gateway, we can see the front of the gigantic temple of Hathor. As she walked through the front portal and looked up toward the sky to the molding above, Cleopatra would have seen the benevolent rays of the sun, represented as giant wings. On the inside, there is a depiction of one of the countless images symbolizing motherhood that are scattered around the temple. It illustrates the goddess Isis seated, breastfeeding little Horus, the future husband of Hathor. Along the temple's side wall, we can see Hathor breastfeeding Ihi in the presence of a pharaoh paying them homage. Many temples of this period had colonnaded courtyards leading up to them. The Temple of Dendera, instead, went without a colonnade to make the front of the building more imposing. The 6 gigantic columns of the building itself are connected at the bottom by a wall and crushed by a hefty cornice to form the entrance to the vestibule. Entering the temple was considered an initiation and spiritual voyage. Cleopatra, the only non-priest who would be allowed inside, would find herself walking through a series of rooms where the natural light would grow dimmer and dimmer until she reached the most sacred place in the sanctuary, the cella, where the statue of the god was placed. Then the light would take on an almost mystical brightness, a reflection of the god's metaphysical presence. A number of staircases connect the temple to the terrace above. It is here that statues for worshipping the goddess Hathor were brought in a solemn procession once a year so that they could unite with the rays of Ra, the sun god. From the terrace, we can see the many buildings in the sanctuary. This is the sanatorium, like a hospital, with many small rooms where the sick used to wait for the goddess to visit them with a cure for their ailments. This well-preserved building is one that dates from the period when Egypt was already a Roman province. It is the Mamesi of Trajan. The Mamesi is a very common building in Egypt, a sacred place where rites were performed connected to the birth of the son of the sacred couple who were worshipped in the main temple. The Mamisi at Dendera is dedicated to Ihi, Hathor's son. This relief depicts his birth, feeding, and growth. Standing out from those who are worshipping the sacred child is this figure, dressed like a pharaoh, whom we meet in the main temple. But he's not Egyptian. The hieroglyphic text identifies him as Nero, the Roman emperor. These figures on the boat of life are Emperors Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. On the south side of the temple, shaped like lions' heads, are gargoyles, which, besides being decorative, carried rainwater to the outside of the building. The figures sculpted in the wall below them convey an entire scenario, this time instigated by Cleopatra. This gigantic bas-relief depicts Cleopatra introducing her son Caesarion, whom she had had with Julius Caesar, to the goddess Isis, who is preceded by her son Horus, represented as a child. What was Cleopatra trying to communicate with this original relief? According to a recent study, the similarity of Cleopatra's and Caesarion's position with the position of the two gods is thought to be a mirror image of Isis and Horus. But that's not all. Osiris, Isis' husband, who was killed by his enemies, is not portrayed in the bas-relief, and neither is Caesar, who was slain by Brutus and the senators. By this clear similarity with the powerful goddess, the great queen wished to be considered as the new Isis. And as a goddess, she reminded the Romans that she was the only legitimate sovereign of Egypt. Another great sanctuary of the Ptolemaic period that Cleopatra must have visited on one of her trips to the south is the one dedicated to Isis on Philae. Because of its great beauty, the island of Philae was called the Pearl of the East by travelers in ancient times, and has been a favorite of artists and painters throughout history. The unusually beautiful monumental complex almost disappeared when it was being swallowed up by Lake Nasser. In 1968, UNESCO and the Egyptian Ministry of Culture called for the international community to help. An Italian company, led by architect Giovanni Iopolo, was called upon to meticulously rescue this architectural beauty. He had the entire complex taken down and put up again on the island of Agilkia, about 330 yards away from its original site. This is where the sanctuary still stands today. It took almost 7 years to finish the work of surveying, taking down, transporting, restoring, and reassembling the millions of stone blocks that made up the original sanctuary. The temple, which was erected in its present form by the Ptolemies in the first half of the 3rd century BC, is dedicated to Isis as the creator of life. She is portrayed there in numerous bas-reliefs as the goddess who brought her husband Osiris back to life after he was murdered by his brother Seth. Pilgrims traveled to the temple from every part of Africa and beyond. Even the Roman emperors were devoted to the goddess. Proof of this is found in the elegant pavilion that the Emperor Trajan had built. Despite its monumental appearance, it was an airy structure that was large enough for processions to enter inside. The sanctuary at Philae was the last center of the ancient Egyptian religion. In the Christian era, when various churches were erected beside the temple using the pagan monuments of the sanctuary, the temple continued to be considered the house of the goddess Isis, the great mother of Egypt. The goddess did not seem extraneous to Christians. The depiction of Isis breastfeeding Horus is the forerunner of the Madonna and Child. Also, the salutation to the god Amun, who was worshipped to a lesser extent on Philae, became the famous Amen, the Hebrew and Christian salutation. The splendid sanctuary at Dendera and the incredibly beautiful and spiritual one on Philae were places that were always dear to Cleopatra's heart until the end. According to Egyptian religious belief, by dying bitten by a snake, a creature sacred to Isis, she secured eternal life. When Cleopatra went to Rome in 47 BC with the son she had had with Julius Caesar, the magical civilization she represented followed her to the new capital of the world. Rome was mesmerized by the tantalizing queen and her culture and began building Egyptian-type monuments in Rome itself. It was built by Gaius Cestius, who died in 12 BC. The pyramid is completely covered in white Carrara marble and was built in record time, a little less than 300 days. Cleopatra would have loved the irony of her conquerors copying her country's treasures. The obelisks were the first great masterpieces of Egyptian civilization brought to Rome. Though some Greeks and Romans mocked them, the Greeks called them obeliskoi, or skewers, while the Romans called them Cleopatra's needles. The obelisks were placed in front of temples as monuments connected to worshipping the sun, and were generally covered in hieroglyphics. One of the many mysteries that shrouded Egyptian civilization was how these gigantic columns were built and carried to Rome, considering that they are monoliths, meaning that they are cut out of a single stone block. These are some of the largest Egyptian obelisks in Rome, the city that boasts the largest number of them. This obelisk is situated in the Piazza San Giovanni in Laterano. Originally from Thebes, it is made of red granite and is the tallest obelisk in Rome. Emperor Constantius had it moved to Rome in 357 AD. The obelisk in the Piazza del Popolo was erected by the great pharaoh Ramses II. Originally it was at Heliopolis, but Emperor Augustus had it moved to Rome in 10 BC to commemorate the 20th anniversary of Cleopatra's defeat. Over the years, Rome's collection of statuary, bas-relief, and precious objects from Egypt grew. The Capitoline museums house many statues of Egyptian gods and sphinxes, like this one in red Aswan granite that dates from the time of Cleopatra. It was found in 1856 in the Via Sant'Ignazio in Rome, a street in the city's center where much evidence of Egyptian sculptures has been found. But that's not all. A number of excavations have confirmed the presence of an Egyptian temple in the heart of Rome, a possibility that seemed unbelievable before. Here in the zone of the ancient Campus Martius, a great temple existed that was dedicated to Isis and Serapis, an Egyptian god invented by one of Cleopatra's ancestors. The monument has been completely lost, but it looked much like the other famous Egyptian temples, those on Philae and at Dendera. The Romans were not the only ones who came here. The Egyptians did too. Their community, the largest group of foreigners living in Rome, is located in the present-day quarter of Trastevere. Cleopatra probably never imagined she would have such influence on the Romans. The passion, interest in, and enthusiasm for all things Egyptian that has engrossed Europeans over the ages is the legacy of this educated and refined queen, the shrewd politician and loving mother who never lost her concern for the needs of her people. After the dark shadow cast on her personality by the Roman victors, Cleopatra's image has now taken on a brighter light. Though there is still some debate among scholars as to what she really looked like. According to some writers, she was beautiful. To others, she was not. The few Egyptian portraits we have, like the one at Dendera, are sketchy, and there are far too many portraits, busts, and statues believed to be her that it is hard to know which is the true depiction. Perhaps it would have remained one more unsolved mystery if it hadn't been for art historian Paolo Moreno. He believed that the Esquiline Venus housed at the Capitoline Museums is in reality a full-figure portrait of Cleopatra, done while she was living in Rome. Many scholars now share this belief. Seeing her portrait in this statue is like bringing the great queen back to life. Cleopatra herself would have loved this, for one of her strong beliefs was the saying, "Keeping your face is keeping your soul." In many hearts, the face and soul of Cleopatra live forever.